Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is February 6th, 2025, and let's get to the map changes happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? So, first, I'm going to cover the big news from this morning, and that is, of course, I would call it small for now, Ukraine counteroffensive in eastern Kursk. And this has been confirmed by the Russians that the Ukrainians do have some success here, and then we'll go over the other small map changes in Ukraine as well. So let's first cover the big news with regards to Kursk, and the Russians do confirm that in eastern Sudzha, towards the village of Ulyanok, the Ukrainians started a counteroffensive or an offensive in this direction. Now, I believe this is, of course, related to several factors, one of them being that we've talked about it in the past week. North Korean soldiers have completely withdrawn out of this sector. And I've shared with you guys stories about North Koreans regrouping. They've been severely beaten up by the Ukrainians. And so this also weakens the Russian positions in Kursk. Furthermore, I need to also highlight that today marks the 6 months that Ukraine occupies Kursk territory. And this is wonderful because we remember that the Russians in the beginning of this offensive in August said that within a month or two, we'll regain everything, right? We'll do counteroffensive our own. And this was futile by the Ukrainians. And here we are 6 months later. And yes, Ukraine does control less compared to what they controlled back in August or late August. But still, Ukraine controls about 40 to 50% of the territory that they once held. So this is still a great achievement by the Ukrainians, in my opinion. And let's not forget that the point of this offensive, I want to highlight this again, wasn't to push all the way up to Kursk city or get to Moscow. It was about bringing the fight to the Russians, having the Russians bomb their own villages, their own cities, create a refugee crisis in this sector for the Russians to wake up and understand that this war isn't somewhere far away happening in Ukraine. This is also happening on their own soil and embarrassing Putin. So there's a lot of achievements here, achievements from this offensive, which Ukraine has been able to accomplish in the last few months. So we need to be really proud of these achievements. Now, with regards to this Ukrainian offensive, the Russians report that the Ukrainians have made about 3 to 4 kilometers of gains in the last few hours. The main push is towards Ulyanok, but right now there have been some videos that do indicate that there is some Ukrainian presence around this small village of Fantsievka. Now you can see that the challenge here is that there's a heavy wooded area here, which makes it difficult afterwards for the Ukrainians to break through and take Ulyanok. This would be a very big achievement for the Ukrainians if they manage to do it over the next few days. It remains to be seen, but as I've said to you guys in my post today, is that we need to keep our expectations grounded. This is, after all, a war of attrition. At this stage, we cannot expect massive, huge gains, worth dozens, if not hundreds of kilometers. Like, this is not 2022 anymore. And it really is difficult for both sides to have these massive breakthroughs unless something really bad happens and there is no presence whatsoever. Like what happened in Kursk, there was very minimal Russian presence in this sector, which allowed the Ukrainians in August to have great gains. But again, the Russians were able to quickly assemble force, and there is a large Russian presence at this stage. So we shouldn't be expecting massive gains by the Ukrainians here. Again, I think part of this counteroffensive, or this offensive, I should say, is for the Ukrainians to strengthen their eastern flank of Sudzha, because you can see how close the battles were to Sudzha and how basically the Ukrainian forces in Sudzha were within FPV drone range. There were multiple occasions now where the Russians were able to penetrate Ukrainian defenses here with their FPV drones and strike Ukrainian positions in Sudzha. So I think part of it is just strengthening their eastern flank here and not allow the Russians to, eventually, if they were to do their own counteroffensive, to have a lot more maneuverability in this sector. So let's wish the Ukrainian forces good luck, but keep our expectations, of course, grounded, because, we shouldn't be seeing things with rose-colored glasses anymore. This is, after all, as I said, a war of attrition. So this is the situation for Kursk. And, the biggest embarrassment for Putin was the fact that he had to ask for North Korean assistance to regain Kursk, and they failed miserably. For the last 2 to 3 weeks, not a single North Korean can be seen in the front line in Kursk, meaning that they've been beat up so badly that they don't even want to be sitting closely to the front line. This is a huge achievement as well by the Ukrainians, that they've been fighting by themselves over the last 3 years, whereas Russia had to resort to North Korean troops, mercenaries from all around the world, paying mercenaries from Africa, India, Asia, North Korea, of course, all around the world to fight against the Ukrainians, whereas the Ukrainians have been fighting by themselves with, of course, volunteers coming and joining the Ukrainian forces. But it's not like Ukraine is on a recruitment right now on a recruitment run to get as many soldiers as possible from other countries. Ukraine is literally doing this by themselves and accepting volunteers. So this is as well a massive achievement for the Ukrainian forces to have achieved this. So again, I'm really wishing the Ukrainian forces some good luck, but I think that the battle will likely be around Ulyanok, and if the Ukrainians are successful taking Ulyanok, they're going to stop around here, and that's going to allow the Ukrainians to have about, if we're measuring it, about 7 kilometers of gains in this direction, which is already a great accomplishment if that were to happen. Now, let's talk about some other changes in Ukraine, and unfortunately, we need to also be talking about the downsides. Because it's not like it's only working for the Ukrainians. The Russians are also doing their own pushes in other sectors. One I haven't mentioned previously. This front line for now is more or less stable, but the Russians right now have changed their tactics around Kupiansk. For the last 2 years, they've been trying to really rush the Ukrainian positions in the center. As you can see here, this has been kind of their main push from Liman Pershi. And that hasn't been working really well for the Russians over the last few years. So now you're seeing that the Russians instead are trying to create, well, they've already created a bridgehead from the Oskil River, and they're trying to kind of flank Kupiansk from the north and also from the south. It's a lot easier from the north because you can see that the Oskil River is a lot narrower here, and thus it makes it easier to create these bridgeheads and cross. Whereas in the south, the Oskil River widens, it becomes a reservoir, and you can see that over the last few months here, since I believe October, the Russians haven't really made massive gains in the south around Sinkova. And the Ukrainians were able to stabilize the situation in the south of Kupiansk. But over the last few days here, you can see that the Russians expanded slightly their gains since end of January around Oskil, the Oskil River in the north of Kupiansk. So this is an area that I'm going to keep track on. But again, this is nothing to be worried about in the sense of this is not Russia breaking through and literally being at the gates of Kupiansk, but something to be concerned about for sure. So this is one update. And the last update I want to give you guys is, of course, Pokrovsk. And usually this is where I start with on my map updates. But thankfully, we have some good news out of Kursk. But now let's talk about Pokrovsk. And I have some good news for you guys. Yes, the Russians over the last few days continue gaining a little bit of ground day by day, and we're talking about at best a few 100 meters for the Russians. But the good news here is that the Ukrainians have been saying and claiming, and with some truth, of course, that the Russian offensive here has been stagnating over the last few days. And of course, it's too early to tell. We need to have a trend for a couple weeks to really notice this, but the Ukrainians do mention that the Russian offensive has stagnated and that they've really culminated their offensive capabilities in this sector. In December, which the Ukrainians claim was the height of the Russian pushes and offensives, they were doing about 200 plus attacks per day in this entire front line. Now, in early February, this has been reduced to 80 attacks per day that could be noticed by the Ukrainians throughout this front line. So 80 continuous daily attacks by the Russians. So you can see that this brings us to about 2.5 times, 3 times less attacks by the Russians in the matter of 2 months. Additionally, of course, I shared with you guys some images of Russians using donkeys for their logistics. I mean, it's pathetic and also pretty sad at the same time that they're resorting to animals, poor animals that, you know, have to be abused by the Russians to carry and transport logistics, supplies, and ammunition to the front lines. But it really shows to you guys how pathetic and degraded the Russian military is in certain areas. This is not the truth for the entire front line, But now the Russians are so beat up, they lack the vehicles necessary to effectively transport supplies, basic supplies. This really is telling to us more cripples, more disabled soldiers being reused to storm Ukraine positions, especially around Pokrovsk. And I've identified multiple occasions where that happened. I share with you guys the videos and images of Russians complaining that they're being used, injured Russian soldiers being used for, again, future assaults, and there's no expectation for them to be taken care of by medical doctors or whatever. So this is really telling that in this sector the Russians are stagnating, and that they could very soon reach an exhaustion point. It remains to be seen when that's going to happen, but I'm seeing the signs, clear signs and factual signs that this is happening. And two more news I want to give you guys before I end the video is that, one, with all the great news with Kursk, Ukraine also has officially received the Mirage 2000 jet fighters from France. So they're official in Ukraine, and it could be that Ukraine is already using them. Who knows? Again, the number is unknown as far as I'm concerned, and it's fine by me. It's likely that Ukraine received less than a dozen at best. And what is good about the Mirage 2000 is that it's a multi-role jet fighter, meaning that it's a jet fighter that can do defensive operation. Like we've been seeing, the F-16s in the last few months have been defending the Ukraine skies, shutting down Russian cruise missiles, Russian drones, etc. And so the Mirage is also going to complement the F-16, but can also be used for offensive operations against Russian targets. So this is great news, because that's going to also increase Ukrainian attacks against Russian targets on Russian soil. So we're going to, again, see an increase of Russian warehouses, Russian oil refineries and oil depots burning, which is great, fantastic news. And last update I want to give you guys, and another great update, is that Forbes magazine, if I remember correctly, came out with a story today that Russia attempted to scare us again with their Oreshnik, their nuts. So this intercontinental ballistic missile that Putin used, I believe in November, on Dnipro City to scare the world away, that he wasn't bluffing. But apparently, I believe a few weeks ago, Putin tried to use it again against Kyiv, and it failed because it exploded on Russian territory. So I kind of had a good laugh today reading this article, but it really indicates how dependent, and I've shared with you guys in my previous video, I believe, the story of Russia being very dependent on Ukrainian expertise for their rockets and their missiles. And that expertise is in Dnipro, Pivdenne, the Pivdenne Bureau, which is developing brand new missiles, including the Neptunes, the Grim-2 ballistics. And Russia was really dependent on that cooperation for the modernization of their rocket missile program. And that clearly indicates that the Russians cannot produce missiles or produce them effectively by themselves. So this is really telling to us. And again, are the Russians really going to try to take their chances if they were to use nuclear missiles, knowing that there's a 50-50 chance of it blowing up on Russian territory? I say go ahead. I say go ahead. But this is excellent news for all of us, just seeing how the Russians are being degraded, using donkeys to having their missiles explode on their own territory. This is fantastic news. And it really shows how the Russians are just collapsing, militarily speaking. We're not even talking about the economy of Russia, of course. So here you go, guys. This is a small little update with regards to the map changes. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think about the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kursk, about the failed Oreshnik test, I guess, or attack against Ukraine. And I can only wish that they're going to have more of these failed tests in the future. We're talking about Russia, of course. So with all that, guys, thank you so much for your support, and I will see you in the next one. Slava Ukraini!